Thank you very much. I'm always moved to come back to Boston College. I spent 17 years here as a younger faculty member, but that was 28 years ago, which is sort of scary to me to realize. And I especially appreciate the hospitality that the Center for Jewish Christian Learning has for us. To thank the Corcoran chair, Jesper Svartvik, Ruth Langer and Camille, and all of you for being here, and all of those of you who are here virtually. So just by way of introduction, I am assuming that all of you are familiar, at least in general contours, with the abundant scholarship today that resituates the Pharisees in their place in Second Temple Judaism. The resituation process is complex because we don't really have text we can be sure that the Pharisees wrote and so forth. So it's very complex, but it's certainly that's a very important topic in reorienting Christians to a new understanding of Jews and Judaism. I have been mindful for some time that while there is this abundant literature, there is a paucity of understanding of that literature, of the concepts behind that literature in the church as a whole. And I'm speaking, at least in my experience, of both Catholic and Protestant churches, which is not to say that there aren't happy exceptions, but they are exceptions. So I'm calling my introduction, "The Pharisees, So Much Commentary and So Little Change." And Jesper has chosen a text from the 13th chapter of Matthew to highlight this conference theme. And as I was looking over that text the other day, I had sympathy for the Matthean Jesus when he quotes Isaiah, "Seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, and they do not understand." And thus is the church today in so many ways with the Pharisees. So I've been searching for some time about, is there another standpoint that might help us move in a direction that could be more helpful? And I'm looking at it from a viewpoint of an educator, not so much here where I'm interested in the theoretical literature, although I am, but what is involved, I ask myself, in teaching about the Pharisees in a way that has potential to reorient people's understanding and to help them to rework the understandings they have about Jesus and his Jewish context, his Jewish world. So that's the question that's behind my presentation. And there's a handout for people who are here, and Camille is going to project it so you can follow along. Before there was PowerPoint, there were handouts, if you recall the term. We live in a time when nobody knows what a mimeograph machine was or a Xerox machine. Thank God. So as you can see from the outline, just to give you a very brief overview, I'd like to talk first about what are some presuppositions that we can generally assume about the process of helping people reorient. And then what's sort of the current state of the problem? So I got enamored with, you see, pondering presuppositions and problematizing, and I will keep with the P theme as we go through, presenting a panoramic view, producing a script, and persevering. All this in 20 minutes, and may I talk fast. So one of the big problems we run into, in my experience, is that very many people in the Christian tradition across the denominations carry certain binaries that are very hard to dislodge. They've had an extremely long and successful shelf life. The major one for me is the binary of Jesus over against Judaism. An understanding that biblical texts, if they aren't factual, must be false, that Judaism and Christianity have been in conflict from the beginning, and ever thus it will be. And with that, I think a certain assumption that there's a zero-sum proposition in religion. If my religious tradition is true, yours can't be. You'll notice that I have on my notes the Judaism, Christianity binary there twice. I'm an unworthy scribe, but it probably shows how important I think this binary is as a problem. Then I think there are three other problems. I just have two on the handout, but so the first is anachronisms, especially regard to the evolution of institutional Christianity, in which once Jesus appears on the scene, there is suddenly Jesus founding the tradition, the religion of Christianity. A second is the way in which we hear so many generalizations. Jews believed, all Jews believed, or the Jews believed. The notion that Judaism and other religious traditions, for that matter, are homogeneous, or that Judaism is a religion without the ethnic dimension and the peoplehood emphasized. And then I would add to this list ossified metaphors. That is, for me, the one that is most problematic is speaking, as people tend to do, of Judaism as the root of Christianity. It seems never to break through the surface, only to remain as root. So a third problem, I think, is the question of settled identities. We know who we are today, we think, as Jews and as Christians, and we impose that. So there's an element of anachronism there on the people of earlier centuries. But the other thing is we have certain self-understandings of our self-identity as Christians. And when something happens to challenge that, even implicitly, it does, I think, contribute to a real insecurity that people have. And there's a British educator, John Hall, who many years ago wrote a book called What Prevents Christian Adults from Learning. I'm sort of sorry he has the adjective Christian there in front of adults, because a lot of the problems he identifies are the same thing. But there's one chapter in the book called The Need to Be Right and the Need and the Pain of Learning. And so when we just overthrow sort of casually this embedded notion of Pharisees that's in people's consciousness, I think that we, without any intention to do so, raise their defensiveness. And then I would add a fifth presupposition, thinking of Randall Zachman's comments, that people carry, especially people who are not so formed by reading biblical texts themselves, but for whom hymnody is so formative. So I think for many Catholics, for instance, the verses of O come, O come, Emmanuel, and this notion of captive Israel and redeeming Israel, I think those really are, that particular hymn really sets the theme for many people's understanding of Advent. So the second major category is how we interpret Pharisees and what we do with the stereotype. So this is not an entirely new insight on my part, but so if you read the essays in that wonderful volume edited by Joe Sievers and Amy Jo Levine on the Pharisees, in both her essay and that of Phil Cunningham, they give us some clue to how those stereotypes function, have functioned historically and continue. I have another kind of same issue here, just a little different view. So the stereotype of the Pharisees as sanctimonious hypocrites is deeply embedded in Christianity, is everything a Christian disciple should not be. So if we try to reorient people, we can't just sort of claim baldly that, well, no, the Pharisees were sincere Jews who had a particular understanding of Torah and what it meant in everyday life. And so, we kind of pronounce that as if it's going to settle things. But it really is incomprehensible in any important way unless we see that it involves, some sort of larger context. And I'll speak to that in a moment, but let me let me point out some ways of getting at that. And here I'm calling this under the rubric of reception history. But here I want to focus on three very current ones that appeared that are in books or notes in Christian publications. So the first example is from a book called Social Justice Pharisees, Woke Church Tactics and How to Engage Them. So the author, A.D. Robles, represents Pharisees as they are emblematic of the woke church. That is, they are preoccupied with social justice. And that's a bad thing for him. And he says in the book, quote, "These social justice advocates use the Bible as does Satan, drawing upon it as if it were a book of slogans about righteousness and justice." So it's enough in the New Testament text that they demonize Judas as they go along in terms of years of composition, but now we have another Satan, the Pharisees. Now, in stark contrast, James Butcher, who is a Southern Baptist, tells of a new and dawning conviction that he's realized that contemporary conservative Christians look shockingly similar to the Pharisees. In his book, Christian Pharisees, he charges his conservative colleagues of playing the role of self-appointed experts in religion, while in reality, they are mere beginners in spirituality. And then along an analogous line, in a letter to the editor in the July 3rd, 2021 issue of the Tablet, which in this instance, I'm talking about a Catholic periodical published in the UK, that this letter writer accuses the majority of the United States Conference of Bishops of being, quote, in a giddy rush to swap miters for MAGA hats, and thus have embraced Pharisaical transactional politics and squandered the residual trust of their flock. So the question becomes, is the view of the Pharisees determined by your ideological stance? So I think people, if you give examples like this, I think people can understand that there's a fluidity for how we've represented Pharisees, and perhaps by taking them into examples like this, it might be the beginning of them finding a new way to think about this whole issue. So where to from here? I would say that one of the things that is really important, and Peter and I have worked together on our presentations, so in some cases I'm going to just refer to our own conversation and what he'll be saying. But this notion that learning, that whoever is the teacher is not the only person who in the room who has wisdom, and that learning is a communal endeavor of engaging participants, and that people have a stake for their own spirituality and understanding the Pharisaic movement in its context, and thus a little more about Jesus in his context. So that leads me to talk about then what is a panoramic view. I think one of the great problems is that we have this massive, wonderful scholarship, but we have such limited time, and I think this is one of the things you're going to speak to, such limited time, so much information, so little time. And so one of the things that I think, and maybe if I could distinguish myself from the older teacher and the younger teacher, is that we need to make use of omission in the service of clarity. And thus the need to decide what about the Pharisees should be taught, or what do we want to have people to learn in this context, in this amount of time, and for what reasons. And, I would like to mail a copy of the Pharisees, of the book, the new book from the Rome Conference, to every priest in the United States of America. However, I don't have a budget for doing it, and B, The reality is most of them, 90%, 95%, 98%, wouldn't read it because they really couldn't, they don't have they don't really have the learning or the time to read it. So it's incumbent upon us as scholars not only to write for our peers, but to think of in what ways can we use our knowledge to make accessible to other people who don't have the same background. And the problem with that, and this is the second thing that happens, is if you want to omit in the service of clarity, then you fall into the danger of oversimplification. And given that it's such a still controversial topic, or at least a topic that's so complex that we can come to tentative conclusions, then I think, so we have, again, I think this is where we call on our own scholarly backgrounds. What do I see as absolutely essential in the scholarship for this group and this time? So my suggestion is that scholars in general, or scholarly groups, I'm thinking since Peter and I have known each other for a very long time, and others who are here virtually at the Christian Scholars Group, so maybe as sort of a group project, various other group projects, maybe the center here sponsoring something. Could we do something like producing a script? A kind of, here are some ways to talk about the Pharisees or to talk about certain other areas. And so, as I think about what should be in a script, and I think it was AJ or somebody who came up with the idea of sample homilies, maybe that's in her article in the book, The Pharisees. I'm not thinking so much of anything that's full blown as homilies because we don't know the occasions. But what are some things we might say about, for instance, I have 5 things here, about Judaism in the Second Temple period, or what E.P. Sanders calls common Judaism. In my experience, most Christians, and I mean those who come to Union Seminary, and I mean people who are serious in terms of their theological education, really know nothing about Judaism, period, or what they do know is really entirely through a Christian lens. And and I'm not sure I'm crazy about the term common Judaism, but it is in the literature, and I think there's some fine pieces written by it, and certainly Sanders' work himself is an exemplar. I love the aphorisms of Paula Fredrickson, who has such a happy ability to say complex things in a memorable way, where she talks about the notes were the notes, but the Jews played a lot of improv. So this understanding that just as now, but in different ways, common Judaism embraced a lot of diversity. At the same time, there were these certain beliefs and practices that people held in common, or they may have held certain beliefs and promise in common, but that they in some way differed in practice and so forth. My second thing, as you see from the outline, is about Jerusalem and the temple, the importance of Jerusalem. And Peter's going to show a diagram that he's done on Second Temple, the different Second Temple Judaisms in an elliptical form. And by script, I also am meaning things like diagrams and things that help people who learn from not only from text, but from different visual representations. To talk about the fact that there's a lively Jewish life in the diaspora, and what are the different issues in the diaspora that are in Judea and the Galilee. Certainly under nomenclature, to come back to an earlier issue, the meaning of Torah, again, most Christians hold it in a very, very narrow way. And then, of course, we have the general misunderstanding of Paul and the law, and that, so it's not a matter only of translation, but the whole way in which Torah has a whole array of meanings, a whole depth of meaning. And then also the importance of understanding the centrality of the interpretive process, and in an oral culture, particularly, especially in the Second Temple period, of that healthy communities develop ways of exploring and probing differences in this sort of back and forth of argumentation. And this is something I think culturally, Christians do systematic theology and not the kind of sort of debate that also it includes in the text the minority opinion. So, and how argumentation in the sense of searching for an interpretation that leads to a true holiness of life, that form of argumentation is highly to be respected, and that when Jesus, for instance, is pictured as arguing with the Pharisees, that he's doing something that's characteristically Jewish and part of the overall culture. Something surely about the Roman Empire and how, which I think is the crucial background for understanding the passion and death of Jesus. And then to, in some way, speak to the emergence of Christianity as what Anders Runeson calls, quote, a gradual process, often ambiguous and never linear. And I think if we could take that, we who are working with Christian groups, as trying to orient ourselves that Christianity comes gradually, it never comes it's not a trajectory that happens in some sort of way that is laid out from beginning to end. And it's filled with ambiguities and all kinds of other situations. Now, there's so much more, and I'm not in producing or in writing these 5 points that might be part of a script. I'm not trying to say that these are necessarily the most important. What I would love to do is to start a conversation among scholars about what should be the primary emphases and what are ways we might talk about it. We might shape them more in particular ways to certain denominations than to others. That is, we all have our own inner lingo as well, which is why the ecumenical aspect of this scholarship is so important. And finally, it seems to me this is a task for the long term. We are not the notion of who the Pharisees are is so deep rooted in Christianity and so connected to all kinds of presuppositions that this is something that certainly the current generation or generations will not solve. But we have the literature. We have so much with so many treasures that it's time for us to look at the old and bring out the new. And finally, I'll just leave you with, like to quote the Pope once in a while, especially at Union. I feel like a real revolutionary when I do that. And especially, of course, I like to quote Pope Francis. But in his, the letter that accompanies the book, he offers the hope that what will happen, and here I'm quoting, that it will leave a broad echo within and outside the Catholic Church. And I certainly share that hope. And then he wishes on the scholars, quote, abundant blessings from the Most High, whom Jews call Hashem. Well, I think I can't top that. So I turn now to my colleague, Peter Pettit, whom I could assure you is never petite, but always a giant in thought.
Thank you, Mary. You'll give us just a moment. I'm going to try to get my own video playing here so that yeah. Does that work okay, Camille? Excellent. Thank you much. Oh my gosh. I don't know about a giant in thought, Mary. I thought I was just another one of your alliterative P's this afternoon. It's just Peter Pettit following on the other 5 that you had there. A number of years ago, I was invited to teach in the Wednesday evening series at a Lutheran congregation on Jewish-Christian relations. And I distinctly remember the evening that I did this sort of long history of Christian anti-Judaism, starting with New Testament texts and moving through early church theologians, et cetera. I got to the end of a 45 or 50-minute presentation, And a woman in the back was the first one with her hand up. I called on her and she stood up. She said, "Pastor, I have been a Lutheran all my life. I'm 70 years old, and I can tell you, they never taught me to hate the Jews. They were far too busy teaching me to hate the Catholics." Now, what that said to me was, I just missed my audience. Whatever I was trying to teach about Christian anti-Judaism, at least one member of my audience never quite got there because I didn't really connect with how she came into Lent and what was going on. And how often is it what Mary has talked about, what Mary says she has wondered about and noticed for decades, as we all have? It seems like somehow we just miss the audience. And so what I'd like to do today is to talk about some principles regarding our relationship to our audience. I do that primarily because I've spent most of my career making all the mistakes you can possibly make. So I have a pretty good record of the things that don't connect with audiences, and gradually I start to build a few things that have begun to help. And so before I move into that, that brings me to saying my thanks for being here. In part, really, I have to start with my thanks to St. Paul Lutheran Church and its community, which has provided me a remarkable place in which to try to be a teacher of these things in a local Christian community. To Jesper, the Corcoran chair, Ruth, Camille, all who are involved with the center here at BC, colleagues on Zoom last week and here in the room today. Lenny Gordon, good friend and colleague who talked through these issues with me as well. And of course, Mary, for yet another marvelous example of scholarship in the service of pedagogy. Many thanks all around for the privilege to be here. There are two aspects of gaining traction that I'm not going to particularly address, and I'll reference them quickly. The one is the rather narrow focus of how do we get these things more effectively into seminary curricula. And I do that primarily because I've spent enough time teaching in seminaries and in a college and academic settings to know that that's a very local political problem. And I'm not sure that there really are principles for getting things into seminary curricula. Every seminary culture is its own petri dish. And how it will grow and develop is really up to the faculty who are nurturing and nourishing what grows in that seminary. But the other thing that I really don't feel we can address today, although it's vitally important and it has been referenced, is in some sense the broadest framework for this concern, and that is the deep bedrock of anti-Judaism that David Nierenberg has helped us recognize as underlying white Western culture. It's there whether you have any notion of what the New Testament and early Judaism were, whether you're a religious person or not. There is that deep metastasized sense of anti-Judaism into which so many different attitudes and movements and complaints can tap. And it's just too broad for us today, although it cannot be ignored as we think about how do we address this legacy of Christian anti-Judaism that we're talking about. So what is the one that I'll address? Well, I've signaled it already. I'll be addressing working with lay people in a local Christian congregation. And mutatis mutandis, I trust there will be something that is valuable for those who work with lay people in local synagogues. 4 principles about our audience. First of all, know the audience. Mary's talked about this a bit, but I would underscore it and say boldly, few people care about this topic per se. They just don't. It's not on their radar. As far as anti-Semitism and human relations, general ethics can take care of that just fine. And besides that, if we lead with this is the way Christians have been anti-Jewish, there is a natural reflex response that comes out in two ways. One is to say, well, that's not me. I've never thought those things. And the other one is to say, well, that may be true, but then they weren't really Christian. So we can't just lead with, hey, you need to understand something about Christian anti-Judaism. Folks come to congregational learning and to congregational worship because they want to live a faithful life. They come in search of comfort. They come in search of hope. They come in search of stability for their lives. And frankly, given the lives that most people live these days, they have limited focus and energy for any topic, let alone one that isn't already on their radar. So what can we learn from this? First of all, we're doing homiletics, friends. We're not doing exegesis. We've had brilliant exegesis throughout this conference. And Mary has documented, and many have documented, the incredible historical and biblical scholarship that has been done. It is crucial. It is crucial as what goes into what we teach. But the question for us is, how does it come out of what we teach to land in people's ears? Don't, as my homiletics professor said, talking about women's foundations, I think that was the phrase, this was decades ago, that good foundations make for good presentation. But he said, don't let your exegetical underwear show. The whole point is the presentation. And there I would suggest that there is a remarkable value in mnemonics, like, say, alliterative outline structures. In schemata, even though they risk oversimplification, and in repetition, because we need to say it over and over again, because we have to repeat it constantly, because we can't stop telling people what we're going to tell them, and then tell them, and then tell them what we told them. If you take a look in the handout on page 2, and for those who may not have printed it out at home, I will see, can we get a focus? No, it's not focusing, shoot. All right, forget that. If you have the handout, look at page 2. Oh, that'll work, thank you.
They also have it in the chat.
They do have it in the chat. So let me just see what I can do with virtual background. None. And we should actually get, there it is. This is the handout on page 2. What you see is a gross oversimplification of 2 pages of gospel parallels with a column on John added to show the narrative creep from Mark, the earliest gospel, through John, the last gospel, of the way in which Pilate gets exonerated and is presented more and more generously throughout the Gospels, and therefore, by default, the Jews get more and more of the blame. Is it oversimplified? Absolutely. Did my handing out 2 pages of gospel parallels communicate well with people? Never. Does this one? It has. We're preaching. We're not doing exegesis. The other thing is, well, and I find this to be true, frankly, with clergy and with educators just as much as it is with lay people. Unless they've come and signed up for the exegesis, they're also looking for the homiletics, the presentation of it, not the debates within it. Also, we need to address topics that matter to the audience. So far, in almost 3 years of teaching at St. Paul, my weekly Bible class has studied prophets, Glenn Powell's book, Saving the Bible from Ourselves, something I called the Bible's Big Stories, Jamie Clark Soule's Reading John for Dear Life, and we're currently in the midst of parables in the Gospels. Not a single one of them focuses on Jewish-Christian relations. And yet, at one point recently, when we were talking about Matthew and the possibility that what we were reading in the parable was a reflection of the destruction of the temple, one of my lay people said, well, and this may have had something to do with the destruction of the temple that they had recently experienced somewhere around 70, right? Absolutely, exactly 70. Somehow that date came through. Or when we got to looking at some Q parables in both Matthew and Luke, and I highlighted some of the differences between two of them in the two Gospels. And at the end of my doing a little highlight presentation, one of the people said, but Pastor, which one is true? With just that much dripping sarcasm, and the room cracked up, because they know that at St. Paul these days, which one is true is not a question to ask about differences in Scripture. The question you ask is, what made that true for that writer and their community? We need to know our audience. Second, we need to respect the audience, trust them to move with us. It's so easy to shortchange them and assume that their capacity or their willingness is not up to what we're trying to convey. We need to build from their experience. When we introduce a new concept, ask people, what does that sound like to you? Give them a chance to process it through their own experience. These are often professional people. They're accomplished adults who have their own lives and their own areas of expertise. Let them do the translation into the terms that are their own, and then affirm that when they do it well. Use it and bring your own to build even imperfect images. Here we turn to page 3 on the handout, to the top half of it. This is a diagram that Mary referenced in her talk, something I call a geometry of first century Second Temple Judaisms. And, you know, for people who are actually math geeks, they do sometimes show up in Bible classes and they kind of appreciate this. I say, who knows what an ellipse is? And somebody can often say it's a geometric shape that has two foci. What makes it an ellipse? Every point on that oval is equidistant between the two foci. So here goes a little math geekdom. If you're looking at the diagram, A plus B equals A prime plus B prime. Two very different points on the ellipse, but each of them, if you add its two distances from the one focus and the other focus, those distances are identical. Why do I use this diagram? Because Second Temple Judaism had developed two foci. There was the Second Temple, but coming out of the exile, there is also now a Torah. And so Torah and Temple we can understand as the two foci of Second Temple Judaism. And then we can start to locate Second Temple Judaisms on the ellipse. Not that any of them has priority over the others, but some, like Pharisees, are a lot closer to Torah and farther from Temple. Some, like Sadducees, are a lot closer to Temple and farther from Torah. I would suggest the Dead Sea Scrolls sect might represent a kind of balance as they create a Torah for a time while they wait for a temple. But however you do it, it's a graphic that helps people to understand that complicated world of Second Temple Judaisms that can be so difficult to describe. A side point on this: listen carefully to the size tires with which your people drive in. If we think that they're driving on flat tires and we need to replace them, it's crucial to give them the same size tires that we're taking off the car. We can't have somebody who has a 5-sentence understanding of first century religion and immediately expect them to absorb 2 chapters of a book worth of explanation. If we're taking off a 5-sentence tire, start out at least by putting on a 5-sentence tire of a different make or tread, or however the metaphor would work out. And another thing that Mary mentioned, I would emphasize, underscore, acknowledge the sense of loss that comes with this, even a sense of resentment. I can't tell you how many people say, why did nobody ever tell us this? I grew up in the church. I've been in the church all my life. Why didn't anybody ever tell me this before? Acknowledge that sense of loss, that there is something that maybe they've been missing. But I was missing it too until I started doing this stuff. I didn't start out understanding this any more than anybody else did. And yes, there is some loss, and yet it's not a loss of the essence of the faith. It's not a loss of the essence of your participation in the community or your relationship with God. It is rather a realignment of your understanding of that. And with that, what becomes the next essential thing? Empower your audience. Frame that essence in new, accessible terms. This is a lot of what we've been talking about with the master story this afternoon. And frankly, I'm going to bail out on the notes that I put together because I want to riff a little bit on what we've heard about that master story. When Mary talks about about omission in the service of clarity, that becomes essential, as a couple of my diagrams have already indicated. The new master story is far more critical than the debate that we've been having this afternoon about what the master story is, or making sure that we respect everybody's possible understanding of the master story. Randall, I totally agree with you that Christianity has that master story. It's locked in. And yet, when you tried to cite it, you cited a hymn. You do cite John, although I disagree with your exegesis of John, but that's not my point. When Matt Tapey said, so what texts do you use to offer people this new view of how things work? What are they? Where do we go with that? Mary Boyes, in her Redeeming Our Sacred Story, has taken a run at that in a book-length treatment. Phil Cunningham, similarly with his Story of Shalom, has given us an offering of how the master story might read. In my own Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, we're just about to release a 60-page guide for preaching and teaching with love and respect for the Jewish people. And it has 3- and 4-page treatments of 10 different topics in this arena. 3 and 4 pages on 1st and 21st century Judaisms, 3 or 4 pages on law and gospel, or gospel and law. Not the extended treatises, but things that a pastor or a teacher can have on the desk. And when they get to that topic, say, oh, I think I remember that in the guide. Pull it off, quick reference. Doesn't take all afternoon to figure out what I'm going to say in the next paragraph, and off they go. I'd suggest part of the shared vocabulary that we need to have, that we need to help people with, is just basic historical framework. So if we're talking about biblical Israel, can people recite Exodus, kingdoms, Deuteronomy, exile, occupation, diaspora? Bam. Seriously, if they have those 6 touch points, you can fill in whatever else you need to, depending on the particular topic. Early Christian timeline, Jesus, Paul, 70 Gospels, early churches, 4th century. Those should be the road marks, the landmarks along the road that we just keep reiterating. And of course, the crucial intersection of those two at 70 of the Common Era with the fall of the temple. That crucial point, to echo Yael's question last week, or comment about ensuring that we talk about both Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity as the new. Jesper's affirmation that we are extending and not replacing, or simply offering an alternative. These are things that emerge from the intersection of those timelines at 70. I would offer 4 hermeneutical keys here, and I'll buzz through them quickly. First of all, it is this point of continuity between biblical Israel and both Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity, that both of those communities, as we know them historically and still today, both of them seek to claim the heritage of biblical Israel as their heritage, as the beginning of their master story, but they do so in continuity with biblical Israel, and therefore they're going to have certain parallel constructions which can be mutually informative or mutually competitive, depending on how we present it. Well, which way are we going to present it? What about the complementarity? And here we come to Marquardt's idea about an evangelical halakha. Second, biblical diversity necessitates theological interpretation. Seems to me that's a fundamental point that we need to be able to convey to people, that it's not a question of which part of the Bible is true. It is that biblical diversity necessitates theological interpretation that gives us freedom to interpret, or as Marquardt would say, it gives us the obligation of interpretation. The problem's not in the text. The problem is that we have to take responsibility for our interpretation. In the Reformed traditions, this has taken the form of confessional development, that different confessions have been produced for different times in the life of the community. In the Catholic Church, my understanding is this is what's called actualizing the text for the particular time in which it's being used. You will know in your own community what the core central theological themes are, those confessional identities are that will hold together your formulation of the new story. Two others. We have to help people understand that the characters in the Bible are characters. They're characters in somebody's story, and that they or they're caricatures in somebody's story, and that what they portray are divisions between sin and righteousness that don't run between groups of people with God on one side and the group being godless on the other. Those are lines that are drawn through the center of the human heart. And they're drawn through the center of every human heart. And the other line that's drawn that's drawn on that chart is between humans and God. And fourth, it helps if we as Christians start talking more about the Bible as God's story and not primarily as Jesus's story. If we start to, and I have to give credit to my mentor, Jim Sanders, who published a book called God Has a Story Too. It's not just that God has a story too, God has the story, if we're talking about the Bible. And when we start there, suddenly what God's doing in the New Testament can be seen much more in continuity with what God was doing in the Old Testament. One more thing from the handout. This is at the bottom of page 3, what Torah teaches Jews and what Paul teaches Gentiles. Again, you can call it oversimplified, but it sure helps people see continuity when you can lay out what's the problem of the people, what's the response, what's the process by which God's mercy and power responds, what's the effect of that, and what's the result of that. And there again, I come back to Marquardt and his evangelical halakha. If the result of God's redemption of Israel from Egypt is the gift of the Torah at Mount Sinai, then one of the results of God's redemption of Gentiles and the whole world from slavery to sin through Christ on the cross is that all can now be God's people. And there's an alternative way to live as God's people, and that's by the gifts of the Spirit. The gift of the Torah, the gifts of the Spirit, we're really not so different. Finally, a note on forming the audience. Adam Gregerman last week asked, were Christian Nazis there as were they Nazis as Christians, or were they Nazis despite being Christians? And I would suggest that when we think about the formation of our communities, we have to acknowledge that for the most part, they were simply Nazis and Christians, both. They had been formed in a way that allowed both of those identities to coexist in the reality of their day-to-day lives. And it's that kind of depth of formation that doesn't require asking the question, is it as or is it despite? We need to be forming people so that we don't ask, are they Christians as advocates for better Jewish-Christian relations? Or are they Christians in some other, they're just Christians for whom the continuity of God's work in biblical Israel and in rabbinic Judaism and in Christianity has become self-evident. We have to affirm what they already know and work with. And here I think of Michael Azar last week, talking about the Pasch and the way in which his community already thinks about the Pasch as both resurrection and Passover. We have to be consistent and insistent, especially when this isn't the topic. As a parent, one of the best pieces of advice I got ever, don't know how well I did with it, but it was, don't worry so much that the kids don't listen to what you're saying. Really worry that they see everything you're doing. And that means even when we're not talking about Jewish-Christian relations or New Testament or whatever, we have to be ourselves imbued with that master story and consistent in the way that we present it, from Sunday schools through confirmation, in our sermons. How many Christian preachers include positive images of Jews in their sermons, embodying what might be called Christian values, but we know they're not Christian. They're human values, and Judaism nurtures them too. How often do we offer those images in our preaching? We have to model these perspectives and hermeneutics in regard to things other than Judaism, because this dynamic of defining who I am over against what something else is affects every other in our lives and in our communities. Again, back to Michael Azar last week, I think when he was talking about the way in which the early Eastern church theologians are misunderstood, misconstrued, shortchanged in our description of them, my sense wasn't so much that Michael cared about defending the early church theologians. It was rather that he saw that if we can dismiss them, then what we end up doing is dismissing his Eastern Orthodox community who holds them so dear. This dynamic that we're trying to work against impacts every other that the church and synagogue encounters, and we need to be consistent about how we address that. So finally, I would just suggest that if we can begin in these ways to empower and form our communities with new generations and with new perspectives, with new stories to tell, then maybe even those first two that I said I wasn't going to talk about might get affected, because we might just send to our seminaries candidates for ministry who already think differently about these things. And we might just send people out into the wider society from our communities who also think differently about these things. Thanks so much for your patience. It's great to be here.
Fabulous. Thank you both. So we are going to take questions both from those of us who are sitting in the room as well as those on Zoom. And I will just put into chat 3 at a time. Would you like to start?
Thank you. Thank you very much. How should I do? Is this the best way? Can people hear me on the? Yes. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. These were wonderful presentations, so well thought through, a life of experience. And I am wondering whether any research has been done on the effects of this, of the work that you have done and that others have done. Having taught at Brandeis University for 23 years, in which up until I retired in 2019, I continued to be saddened by Jewish students who would tell me that they had it said to them as young people growing up that they had killed Christ, or others, Christian students trying to convert them to Christianity, and it didn't let up over that time period. It was still happening until I retired in 2019. And, I just wonder, it would be very important for someone to get a grant from Pew or some other comparable foundation to do research on what is working to stop this kind of thing.
I've been talking.
I have one advantage in teaching in New York City, in that there's an opportunity, and particularly to teach at a seminary that's across the street from the Jewish Theological Seminary. So to have Jews and Christians studying together in the same class, it is a really powerful and very difficult experience for everybody. For us as Christians to expose the shadows of our own tradition, and for Jews who may have been at least vaguely aware of a fair amount of this, to be in the presence of Christians who are confronting it for the first time. So I guess I share almost all of Peter's recommendations. I don't know exactly how to track this. I guess I would say that building relationships across religious traditions is probably the most important, and I don't know how you could exactly quantify it. Though I think if there were some qualitative research, people who wrote, who did say portraiture of people who have been affected by the changes, I think that might, I think it's not so much that we need data, we need narratives. We need stories of people who were deeply, deeply affected. So, Peter.
Thanks, Bernadette, for the question, and Mary. Well, first of all, another shout out to Davenport, Iowa. I'd love to be able to have more of our large Lutheran congregation have personal relationships with Jews. The Davenport Jewish community would be overwhelmed just by our congregation, let alone by all the other Christians who are around them. So that's just, demographically, that's just really difficult for a lot of people. I'm also reminded that 11 years ago, Jesper hosted a conference in Lund where the topic of it was, if I may reframe it and paraphrase, just knowing them doesn't make them better. In fact, there was research that was done that said sometimes the more you get to know the community, the more you know how to pick at their faults and their shortcomings. And so it's not really, it can be, there's no question that for many individuals, it is the personal relationship that may open this door or that may seal the deal and say, I don't care what your theology is, I know this person and I'm going to go by that. But in terms of a large picture, trying to get some effect.
Clarify before.
Sure.
So I think I'm not so much talking about building friendships. If that happens, I'm delighted, but it's the thing that, what Sarah Lee and I've done over the years, this importance of learning in the presence of the other. Yeah. So when you study certain Christian theologians in the presence of Jews, or certain New Testament texts, it affects your understanding, your self-identity as a Christian in a way that probably doesn't happen in another circumstance. So yep. I'd say the importance is the mutual learning to,
Yep, and I would add to that then for the contexts where it's not easy to get mutual learning going on. That's where who's the Jew who's the Jew that you bring into the pulpit? Who's the Jew that you bring to the front of the classroom or to your Zoom? But I don't mean who's the Jew in terms of bringing a guest. I mean, do we as Christians know Jewish traditions, literature, etc., well enough to exemplify positive traits of human life through the Jewish community? If we do that, it's kind of like learning with and hearing, oh yeah, that, out of their tradition, they came up with that same humility or generosity or patience or whatever that I want to come up with out of my tradition. Research. I'm reminded of Chaim Chertok did a book on James Parks. He also spoke as a Jew, and he talks about the point at which Parks was desperate for funding and wanted a bursary, a fellowship to be able to do his research. And he went to the chairman of the grocery store chain in England, Marks and Spencer. And he was sitting, and the chair of the chain said, so tell me, sorry? So tell me, Mr. Parks, how long exactly do you think this project of understanding and undoing Christian anti-Judaism will take? And Parks reflected on it. And in the book, Chertok says he thought about it. And he knew that if he said too long, he might not get the funding. And if he said too short, he would just seem not to understand the problem. So he finally just said what he thought. And he told the guy, frankly, I think this is going to take 300 years. And the man supported his research for the rest of Parks' life. The research is going to come 100 years from now. But God bless us. Let's get started on the work.
May I follow up with one quick follow-up? To be perfectly honest, I actually also observed in my teaching that I am not certain that many of the Jewish students changed their views on Christianity from taking the courses that dealt with Christianity. I'm not certain that they changed in the process of studying with Christian students. So there's that too.
That's also my experience. I'm not trying to, again, this is a long process, and just as with Christians, we have certain presuppositions, so too among Jews, and depending on, kind of how settled their identity is, so I had a very interesting discussion in class. We have half JTS and half union students in this class about, we were reading, we're doing a little bit on the Shoah. It's, it's an enormous topic, and but I've tried to feature in the course the connections between racism and anti-Semitism, because I think those are, and particularly in a school with a lot of Black students, it's very important to put those two tragedies together, but in a responsible way. And I think that's the challenge. So we had read, as part of our background, a book by the historian Beverly Mitchell, a Black woman, called Plantations and Death Camps. And it's an argument for that, again, the difficulty of, situating Holocaust in the field of genocide studies, and keeping to the particularity, the distinctiveness of the Shoah, but also so she uses as the common frame dehumanization. And I think she makes her case well. It's not a long book, but it's, to my mind, and when I've taught with Shuli Schwartz, we use the book too, and but a couple of the Jewish students, they were all rabbinic students, I had such troubles, like, well, you can't make analogies to the Holocaust. And I'm trying to argue for both its particularity, but also, if you can't make any analogies, how are you going, how are people to understand it in terms of these other situations of genocide and dehumanization and so forth? And of course, they weren't reading the whole book. They were reading, a couple chapters. So yes, but I think I planted a seed, and, I don't have to be right. But I just hope I push them a little bit to just, to rethink things. That's enough for me. So I guess that, Paul plants, Apollos waters, and God gives the increase. Yeah, I think that's what I mean by perseverance. You do what you can, and then they walk away, and who knows 25 years from now, or not.
I just wanted to make a small remark mediating between Peter, your suggestion that people would learn a different approach and the lack of opportunity to actually have an encounter for everybody. So I have very amazing experience actually with the literature that is written in the form of an encounter. When Mary Boyce's previous book has got only one blessing, for example, has a chapter about Trinity. So if anybody ever wants to do an introductory session about Trinity, and this chapter starts with an encounter between students. And so the Jewish counter, the Jewish students ask the Christian students, so, okay, so I never understood, why do you actually need Jesus? Can you not talk directly to God? And then the answer is, oh, it's not really that we need Jesus, he just is. So it was very, when I introduced that in my classroom of Jewish Israeli students, it was interesting because everybody could identify with this dialogue situation. So that could be also a way of introductory literature that is born out of this encounter, and then students actually connect to that very well. You know, they in my try explaining Israeli students what they should think. You know, good luck with that, but they can identify with this dialogue situation in the introductory literature.
Do we have any Zoom? Do you have any I want to invite anyone who is attending on Zoom to unmute themselves and share a question. We will be able to hear you. Yes, Michael?
Yeah.
Michael or AJ, I see two hands.
Well, while we wait for Michael to come on, just a quick question to Peter. Thank you all for this fabulous workshop. Peter, when you put together your Lutheran statement, like your talking points on how to deal with Jews, the one that's coming out, I was just curious as to whether you wrote that with Jews as consultants or whether you just had a bunch of Lutherans come together.
Well, naturally, we're Lutherans, so we could do it all by ourselves, AJ. No, we absolutely did. That whole guide has been reviewed. I guess I didn't include you in the circulation. I'm sorry about that. That whole guide has been reviewed by upwards of 25 people in congregations, in academic settings, and including both Jewish and Christian, not even just Lutheran Christian. There are actually, I think, one of our Episcopalians, one of our Anglicans who's been in the meeting with us at this conference was one of the people who gave some really worthwhile feedback. But absolutely, it has been reviewed by both Lutherans, other Christians, I think even Roman Catholics. I know. And definitely a number of Jewish colleagues. Thanks.
Great. Lauren?
Yeah, you've probably maybe answered my question, but forgive me if I'm repeating a little bit what you said, but I've had the experience within the last few years of Christian friends saying negative stereotypes about Jews, but they don't realize what they're saying. In other words, they do not mean to be anti-Semitic. They do not mean that. They just don't even realize. And I'm following what Mary has said about classes. I assume it's the other way too, that Jews are saying things like that about Christians. And I guess it's just education for those two groups that will try to eliminate that. I'm usually, unfortunately, I hope I don't go around, searching out every anti-Semitic thing, but I sort of have antenna for it, and I speak up, and I hope in a courteous way when I do, say it. But I will point it out when I hear it. I'll say, that's a stereotype. Da, 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 da. I don't know what the speakers want to say about that, but I'm finding it's very subtle, but it's there. And I guess stereotypes die hard. I mean, I don't know if there's anything more to say about it, but.
Yes, absolutely. I think we've all encountered that at one time or another. I know I keep learning things about phrases that I grew up with and assumed just came out of I didn't know where. And all of a sudden I find out that they come out of ethnic hostility or demeaning comments. The place, and I think, yes, we need to learn how we can say that, we can confront that and interrupt that in ways that are constructive. And be consistent about that, kind, but clear. The piece I would add on to that, and I've referenced it to some extent, but it's the things I hear in sermons that just are kind of, they're like the filler in a crossword puzzle. They're not the theme, but they're there. And just the way certain things keep showing up in crossword puzzle fill over and over and over again, these tropes keep showing up over and over and over again. And whether it's that the problem is legalism or the problem is pride or whatever. And at this point in our lives, in our experience, whenever we use one of those tropes, which obviously are sins, they're problems, there are things we need to address, but we need to be really careful every time we use one of those tropes that we know has an anti-Semitic history. We need to be clear that we are not talking about Judaism. It's not enough just not to say Pharisaic legalism. When we talk about legalism, we have to provide the constructive image of legalism outside Pharisees and Jews at all. And maybe even make the negative statement, I'm not talking about Judaism here. I'm talking about the kind of thing that afflicts all of us, because it's so deeply ingrained that if we don't actively disavow it, people are going to hear it whether we said it or not.
Thank you.
I just would add that in her essay on the Pharisees in their book, AJ says Pharisees are we can think of the Pharisees as the child of anti-Jewish stereotypes writ large. But the stereotypes are already there. The Pharisees just happen to fit the bill because they appear so often in the lectionary text. And just to reinforce the discussion in the previous panel, I do think that reform of the lectionary should be a priority of the church. Well, let's just speak of my own church, which is totally premised on a notion of promise and fulfillment. And until that hermeneutical premise is exploded, and thanks particularly, I know that I think this BC recently had Eileen Schuler, the Canadians, or at any rate, I went to check in. She's a scholar of the Dead Sea Scrolls and very active in lectionary work. So we that needs to be a priority. But I don't know, those of us in the Jewish Christian sort of realm, it's hard to, the liturgists sort of have that in hand. But so we don't lack for work.
Oh, there's a hand.
Can we take one more? Okay, wonderful. So we will conclude this panel with Elizabeth's question.
Yeah.
Elizabeth, you're muted.
Sorry.
No problem.
Thank you, everyone, for this wonderful conference. I was wondering, in terms of the pedagogical challenges, especially within the Catholic Church, if Pope Francis's synod presents any opportunities to address those, if that's something that the Boston College Center or Mary or any of the scholars present here have been working on or see as an opportunity.
there's an initiative out of Washington, D.C. in the Office Secretariat for Ecumenical and Interreligious Relations. I guess the question is, at least in terms of the Catholic Church, is anything going to be funded, to produce resources, whether they're videos and that kind of thing? It seems to me, the American bishops are planning to spend $28 million to run a educational campaign about the sacramental life, but particularly the Eucharist. Do we need? Well, anyway, I could suggest a realignment of resources.
Mary, isn't it also how they teach about the Eucharist? I mean, we've talked about the Eucharist here this afternoon. This can be, it doesn't have to be either that or this. Barbara's whole point is, how is our theology of the Eucharist going to be shaped in the future by what we've learned out of the concerns of Jewish Christian?
You're absolutely right. I'm not sure that's how the bishops would connect it. That's, anyway, but that's, I can't fight all the battles in the church. I just try to find, places, paths where we can do the work, and teaching at Union, the problem is a thoroughly ecumenical one in terms of stereotypes and so forth. So,
sitting at the Corcoran conference hosted by Jesper Svartvik, and you're talking about ecumenical and having Randall Zachman at the table with us here. I'm reminded of Randall's comment in a project we worked on a number of years ago, which I have almost tattooed on my brain, that God's rejection of the Jews is the most ecumenical doctrine of Christianity. And, we really need to work on the possibility of having the continuity of God's work with Jews and Gentiles is the most ecumenical doctrine in the Christian church.
I'd like to thank all of you for 2 rich, rewarding conference days here at Boston College. We have explored treasures new and old indeed, and those who search will find. When we met last week, I think it was Matthew Tapi who said that our task as theologians is to read each text carefully on its own terms. And now, towards the end of the days, I will seek to do that with a couple of texts and a couple of words: humility and excellence. Humility first. In her book on conditions for interreligious dialogue, which interestingly is called The Impossibility of Interreligious Dialogue, Catherine Cornell explores commitment, interconnection, empathy, hospitality, and humility. And I'd like to say a few words about epistemological humility. Martin Luther's role in the history of anti-Semitism, anti-Judaism is well known to most of us. Even in his very last sermon, only 3 days before his death, he warned against the perils of Judaism. Quote, "This is what I want to tell you as a final admonition not to become part of a strange sin. If the Jews want to convert to us and cease to blaspheme, and from wherever else they have done, we will be happy to forgive them. But if not, we should neither tolerate or accept them among us." And this fremde Sünde is to be influenced by Judaism, to live with Jews. He was not the first nor the last anti-Jewish thinker, and he remains one of the most anti-Jewish in the history of Christian theology. However, in his very last text, written on a slip of paper found in the clothes that he wore on the night of his death, or perhaps left lying on a table, we find another line of thought. Many of you, especially Lutherans, know that he wrote, "Wir sind Bettler, hoc est verum." We are beggars, that is true. So then, is the Reformer's last thought that we are nothing but sinners begging for divine mercy? That's how these 6 words in German, in Latin, often are presented. But the context suggests another interpretation. And Matthew Tapi said we should read our text carefully. So what he writes previously, just before he writes this, is that no one can ever comprehend Virgil who has not been a herdsman or a farmer for 5 years. No one can comprehend Cicero who has not been a statesman for 20 years. And let no one think that he has sufficiently tasted Holy Scriptures unless he has governed the churches with the prophets for 100 years. Lay no hand on this divine need, rather fall down on your knees and worship at its footsteps. And then the words comes, Wir sind Bettler, hoc est verum. We are beggars, that is true. So he states, no one can understand the Holy Scriptures who has not walked with the prophets, with Elijah and Elisha, with John the Baptist, with Christ and his apostles. In other words, the Bible to Christians is similar to the Roman national epos written by Virgil some 20 years before the Common Era. In other words, the context shows that the words Wir sind Bettler is not a statement about human depravity, but about the greatness of God. It's not a matter of anthropology nor hamartiology, but epistemology, about how little we can understand about the inherent richness of the Holy Scriptures. That was a few words about humility. Now a few words about excellence. Today we are here on campus, not a hybrid, not only Zoom, and now then you are here, I assume it's almost impossible to avoid seeing the motto for this university, Aien aristevein, ever to excel. This is a quotation from the 6th book of Homer's Iliad in a speech by Glaucus to Diomedes, who is impressed by the heroism of Glaucus and asks who he is. And Glaucus famously answers, quote, Hippolacus begat me, I claim to be his son, and he sent me to Troy with strict instructions ever to excel for 17 years. To do better than others, to bring glory to your forebears, who indeed were very great. That is my ancestry, that's the blood I'm proud to inherit. So indeed, that's a fitting motto for Boston College, an outstanding university in comparison to many others in the academic world, does better. And the verb aristevein, I understood, is still used in modern Greek. It often means to get a full mark, to get an A. But as I've been walking across this campus to and from work for 5 months now, I've started to wonder if there's another translation that is even better. Because the words that follow ever to excel in Greek could mean not to be better than anyone else, but rather to above all things be better. So the word allon could be either masculine or feminine or neuter, and the neuter plural, and we cannot know this. So the motto that you see on this beautiful campus could be an admonition to both students and staff not to seek to be better than other people, but rather above all, more than anything else, excel. Because education is not a zero-sum game in which your loss is my gain. And as Mary Boyce said, nor is the interreligious encounter a zero-sum game, and nor is religion a zero-sum game. For me, it's so much more, in the words of Abraham Joshua Heschel, a matter of radical amazement. Quote, our goal should be to live life in radical amazement, get up in the morning, look at the world in a way that takes nothing for granted, everything is phenomenal, everything is incredible, and never treat life casually. To be spiritual is to be amazed. End of quote. I am amazed. I'm thankful to all of you, moderators, speakers, respondents, participants in here, out there, as Stephen Colbert always says, and to Ruth Langer and Camille Markey at the Center for Christian Jewish Learning here at Boston College. It's been a thought-provoking, stimulating, enriching conference, and for this, I'm tremendously grateful. Thank you, all of you.